Thanks for having me. I am so happy to be back with the Vermont Studio Center. I did a residency there in 2012, which feels like a very long time ago because it was. Um, so thank you all for joining me tonight as I talk mostly about my artist practice. And I'm going to start a screen share. We're going to jump right in. We're going to talk today about trains, saints, and observations. I decided to structure this like artist talk a little different, to talk about the things that I find that are kind of like weird passion research projects of mine, things that have inspired me, motivated me. And I'm calling it like an artist practice in identity, devotion, and resistance. And so let's get started. We're going to talk about trains, which come back to my identity in a really interesting way. So I grew up in Houston, Texas, and my first memory of being on a train was at the Herman Park Zoo, riding around. It's this like 30-minute ride that takes you over like acres and acres and acres of planned out space parks. Not as green as, I don't remember it ever being this green. Actually, I kind of remember it always being slightly brown and like very clay. I think they've worked, this is a more updated photo of what the train looks like. But as a kid, it really like, there is something about the magic of hopping on a train, a little train, and riding around and seeing the scenery pass by, and you watch and you see people, picnicking, and everybody's waving too. I don't think people do that anymore, but back then it was a way to sort of like connect as this sort of like, as you're like traversing the landscape, people are waving, you're looking, you're seeing things. And so it started an obsession that I had with taking little trains. And in the summertime in New Braunfels, Texas, I had some family that lived out there, and we would go take the Land of Park train because that was my favorite thing to do, my brother's favorite thing to do. So here is an actual picture of that Land of Park train. And Land of Park is, I should say that it's a park that was designed along the Kamal River, sort of in central Texas, and it's considered like kind of on the verge of Texas Hill Country. Okay, and then we have tiny town trains in Hot Springs, Arkansas, which is a place that after I became so obsessed with the trains at a very early age, when I was in kindergarten, I begged my parents that on spring break, we were all gonna go to Hot Springs so that I could go to tiny town trains and see the miniature train village, because as far as I knew, one in Texas, and the closest one to us was in Hot Springs, Arkansas. So here's a picture of that. Fast forward to being a mom and a parent and taking my kids away on vacation for Christmas break and for spring break, driving from Vermont down to Texas. We would pass through Charlottesville, Pennsylvania, and we would stop at Roadside America, which happens to be, or was, it's actually no longer around, but was one of the largest miniature train villages on that route. And it would always be like a stopping point. We would stop and we would go, and I would obsessively push all the buttons and watch all of the little people dance and move around. It's a strange thing to be interested in things that are sort of like modeled in scale. They're a little kitschy. It's a sense of nostalgia. Oh yeah, okay, so here's also like the Railway Museum in Boothbay Harbor. So I have like, Boothbay Harbor is a very special place to my heart. It's kind of where my original first chosen family resides. And there's a railway museum like right down the road from them. And it's also a place that I would take my kids to visit, and that I would go visit when I was in my early 20s. To look at the steam engines and just kind of like relive this nostalgia. So, thinking about this, like this momentum of identity and trains, I also am really obsessed with train writers. So let's get into the sort of like art aspect of mark making and visual language. And in Texas, I would also like, and I mean, I say this in Texas, I do this now. I still count train cars. I live next to a railroad track out here in Charlotte, Vermont. I can hear it, the train go by every night at 9:30. I hear it in the morning. I can judge where I am based on time when the train passes, if I've made it, if I'm early to work or late to work. It all depends on if I'm stuck in train traffic. But one of the things about that is that I also love to look at the writing and like the visual language of that sort of movement and nostalgia. And so here we have like Bozo Texino was a Texas hobo tramp train writer. And I grew up seeing Bozo Texino tags everywhere. And I used to like think of it as like a sense of or a source of pride if I saw one. Same thing with the Rambler. Rambler was more around Beaumont, Texas. So if we were traveling between like Texas and Louisiana, I would always look, there's big train tracks there. I would always look for the Rambler because that was kind of his territory. And then you had the Longfield amputee who was like, I never actually saw one. I always wanted to. He was a Hot Springs Rambler. So it's kind of funny that it goes back to that. And then we have like a very influential artist to me who was Margaret Kilgallen, who also was really interested in signage and mark making on trains. Okay, so why? Like, where did I get my fascination with this, with trains and train riders? And it all goes back to one person in my family. And there he is. His name was Sostenes Perez. He was my great grandfather on my dad's side of the family. And he was a railroad worker. He actually came from Yahualicua, Mexico. And he was brought up to work, like brought up, meaning like he was imported from Mexico by the United States during World War I to come and work in the Galesburg, Illinois rail line. And they were laying the tracks. And this was sort of part of a big migration of Mexican immigrant workers who came to live in boxcars. There's actually a documentary about these workers. It's called The Boxcar People. It's like a public, kind of like a PBS made video. I encourage everybody to see it. But really, it was about the sort of like communities that were built around immigrant labor in the Midwest, specifically Mexican and Black immigrant labor in the United States Midwest. So at the time, also Mexico was having a civil war, so people were trying to leave. Here's a better picture of him. And so my fascination with Sostenes like really came after me being like, why am I so obsessed with trains? And why do I feel this sort of like sense of joy in hearing the sound, in walking the rail lines, in looking for the tags? And it got me thinking about like what, you know, here was this like really hard manual labor, these workers, what brought them joy? And sort of like, where did that come from? And how does that kind of connect, like, you know, like, how does that connect back to me? So I've been slowly mining family history a little bit. And like I have on the right, you can see like early photos of my dad's family visiting my great grandfather in Galesburg. So identity, like thinking a lot about how identity and past history and ancestry plays into these sort of like ways in which we kind of gather moments of joy and gather moments of connection to other people. Like I would never have really made that connection about the tiny trains and the zoo trains and the miniature train villages if I hadn't later on asked more questions about what was going on in my family and who and where I came from. So St. Barbara. Okay, so St. Barbara is a really strange deviation going from trains into devotion. St. Barbara came to me this is going to sound kind of nutty because it's like, okay, I've had two miracles of St. Barbara. The first miracle happened in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I was driving around with a husband number one in a pickup truck. And from the corner of my eye behind a Safeway, we were actually looking for cardboard to use for art. And from the corner of my eye in a ditch, I saw a saint. And I said, stop, turn around, there's an icon in the ditch. And lo and behold, we turned around and there was this crusty, moldy, dirty icon in the ditch made out of plaster. It's about 14 to 16 inches high. It had no hands. It had no markings other than it was wearing a red robe with a sort of white cape with sort of gold embellishment around it. The photo on the left is the actual icon I found in the ditch, and she's now super decorated and lives with me in my home. But she got me started on another research journey, which was who the hell is this icon and what did it stand for? And it took about, I'd say it took a couple of years for me, like doing many image searches to realize that it was St. Barbara. I combed through like thousands of images until I finally found the actual icon, which was manufactured in Italy. And she had certain markings in certain areas that I was able to sort of like work backwards from to discover that it was St. Barbara, who happens to also be the patron saint of lightning, the patron saint of artillery and artillerymen, of firemen, and she protects against sudden death. Statue on the left here is miracle number 2, where I happened to be down in Brenham, Texas in an antique store and had this like funny feeling that something was looking at me. And I turned around and lo and behold, there was another statue of St. Barbara, which I bought and brought home with me to Vermont. So I should also mention that St. Barbara has a really unique connection with Norwich University as well. They celebrate her Saint Day on December 4th, and they shoot off mortar rounds to celebrate the patron saint of artillery. So just so you know, random moments. But St. Barbara, okay, so there's a couple of things here about her that I find really interesting. One, she's got these like key iconography objects that make her St. Barbara. One is the chalice, the next is the sword, the third is the tower, the fourth is the palm leaf, which actually the palm leaf signifies that she is a martyr. The story of St. Barbara goes like this. She was a young woman who was raised in a pagan family. She had a vision, decided to believe that there were the three, like there's like the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit type of situation, that there were these like 3 miracles that gave her the sort of sense of Christianity or of belief in God. Okay. I should also mention I'm not Catholic. Even though I'm like half Mexican, I'm not Catholic, wasn't raised Catholic. So it's interesting for me to like come about this sort of from like a different angle. But anyway, so her father was building this tower, and in the tower, she decided to tell the builders to put in 3 windows for to celebrate her faith. And when her father came back, he was so incensed, he immediately tried to kill her. And as he tried to kill her, lightning came and struck him down and killed him instead. So, just fascinating, gruesome story there. But that's what made her saint, essentially, is this mythological story. He did end up killing her in the process, therefore she becomes one of the martyrs. She's also one of the 14 holy helpers. A holy helper in Catholicism is somebody that people would sort of invoke or pray to help them through tough times. She was really special though, because she was one of 3 holy helpers who happened to be women. The other 2 were St. Catherine of Alexandria and then St. Margaret of Antioch. Both St. Catherine and St. Margaret were reportedly, they were the saints that came to Joan of Arc, who told Joan of Arc to press on the mission of France. And so like I always found that really interesting, that there was sort of this like trio of female holy helpers that women could essentially pray to for various reasons. The reason why folks would like, why women would pray to Saint Barbara was actually to protect against sudden death and childbirth. And so I always found that really interesting. And I think it's something also to be said that in 1970, these 3 female holy helpers were demoted. Their sainthood was revoked by the church. And this was at a time when feminism was on the rise. And, you know, since medieval times, medieval ages, women were praying to these 3 saints to help and to empower them through really tough situations. And then in the 70s, all of a sudden, the sainthood is revoked. 3 other male saints are granted sainthood. And the reason for the downgrade was that their stories were too mythological and not believable, which I always found kind of like fascinating, because most stories that you read of saints are kind of mythological. There's always like the miracle that is performed, and that this sort of like feat of, you know, just sort of like this unimaginable, uncanny feat that is accomplished or done. So to me, I'm like, this is something that is like further research off in the future, but is something that I've spent an enormous amount of time, maybe too much time researching and getting into. So the third part of this is observation. And I'm going to link this to resistance. And this goes back to the beginning of the pandemic. So I became really interested in an Instagram art historian who did, and he was an art historian and a skateboarder who did satirical critiques, like an art critique, or like an art historian's critique on art of skateboarders doing tricks. And for the first, I'd say like year of the pandemic, every day somebody would send him a clip of them doing some sort of trick, and he would sit there stone-faced and critique it as if he was an art critic, really getting into, you know, talking about the aesthetic nature of what they were doing and how they looked. And then he would talk about technique, and he would talk about form, and he would talk about lighting. He had a whole list of rules. His name is Ted Barrow. And his account got deleted at one point, and for reasons that were sort of unknown to me. But then he started another account where he was really starting to focus more and more on art history and the looking and the observation and the critique of observation. And one of the very first things that I fell in love with was this critique that he did of an Ingres painting, where he talks about the flowers in this woman's hair. This is a Mannerist painting. And he talks about how light and shadow is painted, and how really like the ways in which we look at it, we can get a sense of how it's like very delicate. There's this sort of like, he says, the radiant intensity. It feels like there might be parlor light. And he would go on and on and on. This is just 3 examples of like individual posts that I screen captured, which I need to say here is the intellectual property of art historian Ted Barrow, who also runs the Berate the Birds account. If he sees this, thanks for doing all that you do, Ted. But so it got me starting to look at things. And I kind of became, I like was flipping through a book one day, and I became really obsessed with the John Graham painting on the left, which is Cava Canem. And for whatever reason, there was like this aha moment where, you know, you're kind of playing around, you're researching as an artist, you're trying to like take in information, and then you see something and all of a sudden things sort of like click. Well, I saw this painting on the left and everything clicked. It was something about the red, something about the way that her hair like sort of falls along the backside of her shoulder, and it curls up. And then there's this sort of like pompadour, like poof bun in the back, but then how there's like a scumbling of brown across her face. And then just the way that he lays out the shapes, like the shape of the chest, and the way that sort of like black garment just takes up almost an entire third of the painting. And I'd been painting flowers, I'd been painting other things, but I really wasn't looking at my practice as a way of like breaking up shapes and sort of like looking at the way that paint can be applied as shapes and as different versions of brushwork. And so here are two other examples. I think the middle one is called Celia, and the third one I can't remember right now, but I really got into looking at John Graham paintings. And then I started to make abstract work using the sort of language of flowers, but really inspired by that, by John Graham. Really looking and observing. And I realized that like, as an artist and as artists, a lot of what we do is we look and we observe and we absorb information. And there might be places that we visit over and over again or have visited in our past that all of a sudden make their way into current work. And so what I've done now, like what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a couple of images that have significance to me, and then sort of the paintings that not necessarily came out of them, but definitely have some sort of connection to it. So the painting on the left is my friend Maggie's backyard. It's actually her 2 hydrangeas with a hose that connects to water them. The picture, I say painting, picture on the left is that. Picture on the right is a small bouquet of calendula that is at my chosen family's house in Booth Bay Harbor, Maine. And then I have a painting called Looking Down at the puddle made by a leak in the hose. And this was part of tending constellations at Soapbox Arts. And then the photo on the left is a favorite place of mine to go in the summer. It's a little spot at Huntington Gorge. Photo on the right is of hibiscus flowers from my garden. And I really got into like, you know, I love looking up at things. I love laying down and looking up at things. And I love like looking down into things and sort of thinking of the sort of like portals of like looking up and looking down. And then started to really incorporate those views and sort of mesh those 2 types of views. It's like, am I looking up or am I looking down? And this is Silk Petal Artificial Sweetness for my babe. Love the Queen Anne's lace that comes in the middle of the summer. Oh, I should also mention that the work that was produced for the show was not painted in the summertime, was actually painted between January of this year and June. So a lot of the paintings you're seeing were actually made pre-summer, and what's coming out of them is this sort of memory, is sort of this like muscle memory of what these things look like, and then how they sort of translate into paintings. So the Queen Anne's lace here, this is actually photos from the summer prior to when the paintings were made, but this is Queen Anne's lace around my house, my garden. And then what I know for sure is this. So to get into the show at Soapbox Arts, I thought about approaching this. Like I thought, you know, with an artist talk, I could show you all the paintings that I made for that show, but that would be kind of boring to me, because what I want to do is to highlight again about the artist practice and sort of where things begin and how things, just how I tap into it, how I make a painting. So with tending constellations, I'm kind of thinking a lot about from flowers to stars and the good grief that comes along with the inevitable passage of time, but also about the sort of connections of like slowing down and tending to things that we don't normally tend to, and also tending to things that are like out of our control. And so when I feel out of control, one of the places that I turn to frequently is going to the garden, because I can weed things and I can sort of like organize and tend to the way, and it's sort of like a false manipulation in a way, because gardens are just wild. They'll like, the weeds will grow, the flowers will die, some will come back, some won't. So there's always this kind of like lesson in letting go with that. And another place I turn to, so I've got the garden as one place that I turn to. The other place I turn to is the stars, because the stars, even though they seem sort of fixed up there in their constellation-y way, they create a sort of sense of perspective for me, that we really are just a bunch of people sitting on this rock spinning in space, right? And that out there are so many other things that are kind of similar to what's happening. I mean, I don't want to say that there's like life out there. There might be life out there, but there are other rocks out there floating in space, and we just happen to inhabit one of them. So it really helps me think about that and put things into perspective, the sort of like going into the earth and then thinking more about the sort of cosmos and things that are out there. So here's a quick view of the Tending Constellations show that was up in August at Soapbox Arts in Burlington, Vermont. If you want to see more of that work, I encourage you to go check it out on Soapbox's website. For the rest of my talk, we are going to talk a little bit about the very, very, very first painting that was made for the show. And I have to thank somebody here. It was Corinne Yance, who she interviewed me at the Soapbox show. And somebody asked me during that interview if I could point out the very first painting that was made. And I said I couldn't, because it was in my house and it was made on a really cheap canvas as I was working ideas out. And it wasn't in the show because it was just on one of those, like, like Michael's black canvases. And it just felt so messy and so raw, but it really is the first piece that got everything going. So, so here's how it starts. My process in real time starts with a feeling that leads to curiosity and questions, and then uses that sort of framework of my lifelong practice, which always comes back to identity, devotion, and resistance. And I'm reframing things a little bit, because it used to be, I would talk about like domesticity or feminism, but I want to I'm like reframing it now, that sort of last part, to be resistance. The identity is sort of like, I think about like the who behind the work, or the what is compelling me to work on this project. The devotion is, how do I go about it? How do I go about telling the story? How do I go about approaching the work? And then the resistance part is the why. Like, why is it important to me? And why do I keep coming back to this over and over and over again? And it all really comes back to this idea that I have, and I firmly stand with this. I teach this to a lot of folks too that I consult with, which is that art wields power in context. And so you really have to think about what's happening in the moment as the project is unfolding, as it starts, as you're researching for it, as you're playing with ideas, as you land upon an idea that starts to stick. So, and even like in process, like as you're mark making, like you're thinking about that, like what's happening environmentally around you, and how you're sort of interconnected to all of it at the same time. So this is how a project like Tending Constellations begins. And it starts with Maggie Sherman, who is pictured here on the right with her cat Marble on her lap. She has a very special connection with Vermont Studio Center as well, and was an artist who lived in Burlington, Vermont. She was a very close friend of mine who passed away from an acute thyroid cancer this past February. And I met her through playing Mahjong in Burlington in about, I think it was like in 2010 is when I met her. And she's this sort of extraordinary person who asked lots of questions, had bright red lips, great personality, was from Knoxville, Tennessee, and just like, or Nashville, not Knoxville. Sorry, Maggie, Nashville. And she had this charisma and this never ending like curiosity into things, and was always asking me like, what's next? What are you doing? Why are you doing it? Who is it for? Like, what's happening? What's going on in your mind? And as she was transitioning from this world to the next, I decided to start working on a painting. I knew that the show was coming. Like, I had spoken with Patricia Trafton at Soapbox Arts. We had talked about doing a show for August. And we talked about that in about December. And December was when Maggie started to go, like we knew that things were starting to speed up. And there wasn't a lot of time left with her. So I started to work on some paintings, but it specifically started working on this one. So you have to forgive me. The photographs are not great. They were taken with my iPhone in process. I'm glad I have this record of watching this unfold. Started off with a matte black background and just white, complete white acrylic paint. And I'd start to overlay things with washes. I love washes. So kind of like working through, and I'm gonna go back for a second here, like working through this idea of, like, what am I feeling in the moment? What is reminding me of Maggie? What, she had this incredible garden on Lakeview Terrace in Burlington. She had a bed and breakfast, had an incredible view. And then this sort of feeling of like, also of me just kind of being scared about what was going to be happening. And sort of like thinking about like, hands and hands holding things, or like hands holding bodies or hugging, with these sort of like flowers coming out. And then adding these sort of like layers of washes. So like working very slowly, working very methodically, working almost as a form of meditation to process the general headspace that I was in. And then once the wash is dry, putting on another layer of language, floral language, adding color, starting to build up details, more washes. I know exactly what was happening also when I made when this moment happened with these washes. This was the day that my eldest child came out to me as trans. And so all of a sudden I was having, there was a duality that was occurring, two types of transitions. The transition of a person moving towards death and life after death, and the transition of an identity being born. And that really, like, when I think about people talking about how we can have sort of like multiplicity or like dualities at the same time, even if things feel in conflict, it's like one moment to celebrate and another moment to grieve. But really, and also there's like a good grief that kind of goes with both of those as a parent too. Sort of, like the grief that comes with letting go of what the past was and embracing the newness. And then also the good grief that comes with death, which is letting go of what we once were holding on to, this memory, and then moving on with knowing that this is sort of the inevitable and that we're all going to be going through that. So literally thinking about those things as these washes are being put down. and then another layer. And then the color starts to come in. So I kind of like to do like the bare bones it, and then like build up color and start highlighting things and kind of like working with the sort of push and pull. The painting starts to feel like it's breathing to me. It starts to come alive. And then pulling in sort of like shadows, like starting to think about it on a technical term as well. And starting to think about the ways in which like figures start to emerge, and how shapes relate to one another. And there's like hand that's coming in sort of from the side there. And well, I'm not gonna spoil it. I'll show you at the end. And this sort of like wash of coming across. So this is as Maggie, the green wash coming across was when Maggie was really like within her last 48 hours. And then that's where the painting landed. On the left, there's the portrait of Maggie again on the right. And the title of the piece on the left is Miss Marble on Maggie's lap. And so the cat, there's like a little bit of, you can sort of see the sort of pink cat sitting there. You get this sort of sense of this like lily that's sort of like popping out of the cat's, like it's sort of like around the cat's head. The sort of hands that are coming that kind of mimic her hands, this memory of her hands. I didn't look at this picture while I was painting this, by the way. This is a picture that I had in my mind of her. It's a pose that she often took. The cat often sat on her lap. And then just kind of thinking of the dogwood, which is that sort of brown flower to the sort of like center right of the painting. Thinking about that sort of dogwood as just kind of like an anchor, like a little bit of an anchor for that figural space. So thinking about the ways in which that painting came about really helped me break things wide open. You know, it wasn't like I wasn't ascribing to something specific as I was doing this. I wasn't really sticking to a set of rules like I normally do in painting. I was really just trying to like capture the moment as it was coming and the intensity of those moments. And one of the things that I've gotten better at over the years is knowing that like when I'm having a feeling or like an anxiety or a buzzing or something that's coming up, it's like go straight to the canvas and work it out. Because inevitably, and like let it get weird too. Like if it gets weird, it's better. Because it's more authentic. It's like, you know, not trying to control it. And I've totally been guilty of trying to control space and make things look a certain way. And when I do, it's like always ends up too tight or too just doesn't feel like me. So with this, it was really like, I had this little cheap canvas that I had no attachments to, and I just let myself run with it. And I'm so happy. It's not like a fabulous painting, but it has its moments. And those moments are what sort of gave me the launching point for the rest of the work in Tending Constellations. And it's the launching point for work that looks like this. And then also thinking about these sort of like just moments of like light, moments of artificiality, moments of connection, turning to the stars again. Stars started to make their way into this work, that sort of anchoring, and then this sort of weirdness of thinking about how flowers are still out there at night doing their thing, blooming and returning to the earth, and how the constellations are moving across the sky. There was a quick side note. This painting, I think it's this painting that's called the 8:30 FedEx plane. And I used to sit with Maggie on her in her backyard at night, and we'd, you know, be sitting out there looking over the lake. It'd be dark, summertime, And then the 8:30 FedEx plane would fly over, and she knew that it was the 8:30 FedEx plane because she would ship stuff as an artist. She would try to get things on that last shipment out to people who had bought stuff. And so it kind of became this running joke that at 8:30, if I heard a plane in the sky, it was the 8:30 FedEx plane. So again, sort of tapping into that memory, those memories and those stories to create this body of work. And yeah, so that's the end of my slideshow.
Wow. Thank you again. What a wonderful talk. Thank you and have a great night.
All right, thanks.
Stay here. Yeah. Thank you, Wylie.